Hi, I'm Pastor Virgie of Keystone Presbyterian Church. This sermon is part of a series called Making the Most of Your Days, and this one is specifically titled Embracing Your Limitations. We're going to look at a story from the Bible that will inspire us in this regard, which is an unusual story from the Bible, and it's maybe not one that you'll remember. You may or may not remember the story. You may or may not have ever heard it before. And you may or may not be very familiar with the book of Judges, where it comes from. So I'm just going to give you a little overview of the book of Judges. Judges is basically a book where a historian looked back on the history of Israel and they interpreted a certain period of time in Israel's history in a way that they thought was meaningful and that would be helpful. And so this was a period of time where Israel was in the Promised Land. The Israelites had reached the Promised Land, but they kept on getting occupied. They kept getting taken over by these invading foreign powers. And then they would expel the invading foreign powers and they'd have peace, but then more foreign powers would come back in. And so the historian looking back on this said what happened was people were not obeying God's commands. And God held them accountable and said, it's not okay for you to neglect justice. You need to get justice into your social order. And so he would punish them and show them his displeasure by having these foreigners come in and take over. But then the people would repent. They would call out to God. They'd realize they'd done wrong. And they would say, God, help us. Please forgive us. And God would forgive, and God would relent, and God would raise up a leader who would bring them back into God's ways. And that person was a military leader who would expel the foreign power and then was a just ruler. And so these were the judges. And what you see in Judges, the book of Judges, is that this pattern gets repeated over and over, which implies to us that no matter how many times we screw up, no matter how many times we get it wrong, right? God is always there, never abandons us completely. God was there for Israel and just continually would return to them as the people became more and more corrupt. But obviously that's not the end of the story. It goes on after that, but that's for another time. So I will read to you the story of Ehud, and I'll comment a little bit as we go along. This is Judges chapter 3, verses 12 through 30. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. And the Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. 18-year occupation there. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjaminite. Now that was a joke. You probably didn't laugh, but the reason it's a joke is because Benjamin means son of the right hand. So it's ironic for this guy to be left-handed because he's a Benjaminite. Alright. Ho ho ho. Moving on. The Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. So a tribute is basically the taxes that were being imposed. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about 1.5 feet long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. Now it doesn't explain this in the text, so I'm just going to say the reason that's important is because when Eglon goes into the presence of the king, they're going to check for a weapon. But they're going to expect that his sword will be on the left thigh, because a right-handed person would reach for the sword on their left thigh. And so that's why they don't find the sword when they search. Presumably they searched for a weapon and they just missed it because it was on his right thigh, because he was left-handed. So, Ehud, he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way the men who had carried it. And at the idols near Gilgal, he himself turned back and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And the king said, "Quiet," and all his attendants left him. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his summer palace, and said, "I have a message from God for you." And as the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, which came out his back. Most interpreters will actually tell you that what's coming out of Eglon is not the sword. What's coming out is the dung, that the dung came out, which probably is a little bit more humor, potty humor, which the writers of the Bible were not above indulging in. So, Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked, and they said, "He must be relieving himself in the inner room of the house." They waited to the point of embarrassment, but when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them, and there they saw their lord fallen to the floor dead. While they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the idols and escaped to Serah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. "Follow me," he ordered, "for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands." So they followed him down, and taking possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab, they allowed no one to cross over. At that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong, and not a man escaped. That day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. And I just want to point out the lovely sort of bookends that you have on this passage, where it starts out saying they were under occupation for 18 years, and then they had peace for 80 years. Just a little reminder that God's mercy and God's grace are so much greater than God's wrath or God's displeasure with us. So there you have Eglon and Ehud. And to me, what is so fun about this story is that, well, at least I think that what people would have been delighted by when they first heard it, aside from the potty humor, which they probably found amusing as well, was that this guy who was left-handed, which was seen as a disadvantage for sure, and some people probably even thought was like a curse, sign of God's displeasure, anything weird or different was not viewed with favor in ancient times. It was generally seen as some kind of a bad thing, evil. But he turned this into an advantage, even though it could have been seen as a curse, and it was a disadvantage because the world still is made for right-handed people. In terms of our civilization, we designed things for right-handed people. He turned this disadvantage into an advantage, into an opportunity to do something new, something different that nobody had really thought of before, and accomplish something that nobody else could have done. So, as we think about embracing our limitations, there's this story, and then I also wanted to share with you another story which is more contemporary, someone that I think is kind of like Ehud or teaches us the same lesson, as an artist named Phil Hansen. And you can Google Phil Hansen if you want. You can see some pictures of his art. And you can hear his TED Talk, which is how I heard about him. Because he gave this talk where he told the story of how, when he started out with his art, he was obsessed with a style called pointillism. He just wanted only to do this thing called pointillism, which involves you do the shading in your drawings by making little pinpricks. And it's very detailed, and he had to, just make thousands and thousands of these tiny pinpricks. And he spent so much time on this that he actually caused himself neurological damage and developed a hand tremor. And because of that, he was no longer able to do this art because he couldn't make so many pinpricks anymore. And that was very upsetting to him, naturally. This art was his passion, it was his life, it was what he wanted to do. And so he was seeing a neurologist and hoping that this could be fixed, and complaining about how hard it was, and his neurologist suggested to him, just because you can't make these tiny pinpricks anymore doesn't mean that you can't be an artist. Maybe you should start thinking outside the box. Think about how you can still do art even with your hand shaking the way that it is. And so Phil started thinking about how he could do art embracing this limitation that had been imposed on him. And so he started doing shading with scribbled lines. So instead of doing shading with dots, doing shading with the scribbled lines. And that meant that he had to work on a huge canvas, or he had to make a bigger canvas than what he had had before. And he realized that this was giving him more ideas, actually, that he was starting to be more creative because of this limit that had been placed on him. And he, after that, started to think, well, what if I put more limits on myself? And that started giving him even more ideas and forcing him to be even more creative. So, for example, he came up with this fun idea of doing art on a banana. On a banana, right? Who would have thought of that? But it was a way of imposing new limits, because a banana, you have kind of this weird shape that you have to make something fit onto. And so he looked at it and he thought, oh, I'll make a Michelangelo's David. And so he actually went back to his pointillism thing, where he'd make a little pinprick in the banana and then that would turn brown, and so that was how he made this art, banana art. But the banana, if you think about it, is not just limited in terms of the space that you have on the banana for making a drawing, but it's limited in time too, because you can't keep a banana in a museum for 100 years. You can't even keep it for a week. It's going to be destroyed very quickly. And so he realized, oh, it could be an artistic statement to do time-bound art, something that is only temporary. What kind of a statement is that? And so he started experimenting more with that as well. And you can see his art if you Google Phil Hansen and if you watch his TED Talk, which is quite inspirational. It's a lovely talk. I recommend it. But the point is that this guy was much more successful doing these strange kind of works that he was forced into doing because of putting these limits on himself than he would have been if he had just stuck with the pointillist drawings that he'd been doing originally. And so these two people, Ehud and Phil Hansen, they can both be an inspiration to us. They can be a symbol and an illustration of what it means to embrace our limitations, to make the most of our days by not complaining, by not fighting against the frustrating limits that we come up against, but instead finding it as an opportunity. So as we think about what our limits are, what are the limits that I get frustrated by, I'm just going to make a little list that you can maybe think about. If any of these things sounds like one of your major frustrations, right, you can start thinking about it. So it could be a physical condition, like Phil Hansen with his hand tremor. It could be mental illness, could be something like depression, anxiety. Could be maybe an inability to make other people do what you want. And most of us have come up against this limitation and been frustrated, not being able to tell people what to do, or even if we tell people, they want to do it their way and not our way. Sometimes a lack of money is a big limit. Lack of talent. Maybe we just don't have the gifts that we dreamed of having, or that would be necessary to fulfill our big dreams for the future. Or maybe even our sinful nature. God works in our lives to change our sinfulness, to change our bad habits, and it takes some effort on our part as well too, but it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't always happen quickly, and sometimes we can just get frustrated that our sinful nature is getting in the way of the life that we'd like to lead. So for all of these things, sometimes there are things that you can do to help. Sometimes you can improve your physical condition, maybe through exercise, maybe through reducing stress, but sometimes there's just no further treatment. There's just no cure for what you have. Or sometimes depression, you might again be able to help that, maybe with medication. maybe with therapy, talking about it with friends even. But there's not always anything that you can do. Sometimes you come up against the wall, you can't do anything else. The inability to make other people do what you want. Well, sometimes you actually can influence people. Sometimes you can, bribe them or otherwise get people to do what you want. But other times, no, With money, maybe you can rebudget, maybe you can get a second job, maybe you can't. Anyway, all of these things you may be able to do something about, but eventually, probably, you're going to reach some limit that you simply cannot overcome. And that's when you need to start really just changing your attitude and no longer judging it, no longer judging your situation as something unacceptable, something that is simply not right, something that I have to be upset about and fight against. That's when you can start thinking, well, how might this be a gift? And what comes to my mind from the Bible, beyond just the story of Ehud, is the Apostle Paul, where he doesn't explain what it is, but he says that he has this thorn in his side. And it's generally thought that this is some kind of medical issue that he had some kind of illness or condition. Some people think he was going blind. And he prayed to God about it. And there was no treatment for whatever it was, I'm sure, at the time. But he prayed to God, this man of incredible faith who had worked miracles for other people. And yet God said no. God did not heal him. He really wanted it. He really believed in God. It was not for lack of faith or for lack of prayer or trying, but God said no. And so ultimately he just had to accept that this is the way that things are going to be. And he came to see it as an opportunity to practice humility, an opportunity to depend more on God than he had before. So, as we look over our list of limitations, the Apostle Paul and Phil Hansen, they are examples of how a physical limitation, illness, it can lead to, right, in Paul's case, depending more on God, trusting more in him. Or in the case of Hansen, finding some creative solution, some new way of doing things that he hadn't thought of before. Similarly, depression. If we have depression that we can't really do anything about, it may be time to see how it can be even a gift. How can that depression be a good force in our lives? And one of the things that it can do is increase our empathy and help us to be more conscious and more aware of the suffering of others as well. Oftentimes people who suffer from depression are the most kind, the most understanding, the most compassionate toward others. Recently, the actor Robin Williams passed away, and people have been talking, because of his death, about depression and about how awful depression is. But I don't think it's a coincidence that people also have been sharing so many stories of Mr. Williams's generosity and of his kindness. Further in our list, not being able to change other people, right, that can force us to work on ourselves. Enough said. Lack of money as a limitation, it can lead us to greater freedom from consumerism, freedom from materialism. It makes us realize that we don't actually need all the things that we want, things that are advertised, things that our culture tells us that we need. And, right, so that can be a good thing for us. People may realize they don't have the gifts to fulfill their dreams. For example, somebody who wanted to be a professional athlete, but they just didn't have what it takes. Well, they could still coach children's soccer. And somebody actually might do a lot more good in this world coaching children's soccer than they would have as a professional athlete anyway. And as we think about maybe even the limitations of our sinful nature, it may make us feel far from God, that can be very frustrating, feeling like I just can't feel God's presence in my life. But it may inspire us to then seek out God's face through loving relationships with other people, through service, through maybe volunteering, or just through talking with people and opening up and seeing God's face there in a more worldly way. Now that was actually something that seemed to be true of Mother Teresa, that she was this amazing person, but after her death, after she died, her journals revealed that she had felt very far from God, that she was frustrated by this limitation, that she could not always experience God's presence. She went through a dry period, very long dry period in her life, and she threw herself into seeing God in the face of people who were suffering, seeing God's face in orphans and in lepers, outcasts, and so on. So, anyway, sometimes the curse can become a blessing if we're able to suspend our judgment, to stop saying, this is not right, I hate this, I'm miserable because of this, to stop complaining, to stop seeing things as being all evil and all bad, but to realize sometimes our limits are non-negotiable, they're just there, we have to accept them, and if we embrace those limitations, in fact, then they may become an inspiration and an opportunity for God to do something new, to do something creative within us. So, I hope you'll find that helpful, and yep, that's all. Amen.